Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the podcast. I'm really happy to introduce Melissa Cassera from Washington, and she is a publicity strategist. She's also a professional screenwriter, author, and personal brand ghostwriter. And the number one thing she helps is with entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and leaders craft a personal narrative and story that people can't stop talking about, turning their ideas, intellectual property into books and into the written word. Today's conversation is all going to be centered around personal branding and storytellers, and we're going to talk about Hollywood, publicity strategies, marketing, ghostwriting, binge-worthy brands, and I'm really happy to have Melissa on. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, briefly introduce yourself, and I'm really excited to delve into the questions and educate the audience.
Yeah. Like you said, I'm Melissa, and you gave all of my job titles. I did not start out as a writer, I will say. I actually started my career in publicity and marketing and built that over about a decade. And then one day I just decided that I needed a little bit of a break from some of that business writing and decided to pursue some fiction writing, which in that case, it was screenwriting at the time. And so I built that career starting in my mid 30s, which is sometimes unheard of. I was like a later in life bloomer. And then I didn't write my first book until I was 40. Got to bring some different elements to my career as the years went on, which is quite fun. And now I love helping other people do the same.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about publishing your first book in your late 30s, 40s. And so diving into the question is first thing is talking about is this whole concept of building a personal brand and dissect it down when it comes to writing. What does that mean and where should they start?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're a writer, I think oftentimes you just think about the work, right? You're like, here's what I want to put out in the world. I bleed on the page. I want that to go out there and everyone's going to love it. But there is that element of building a platform and building visibility around you as a writer. So distilling that down, I like to think about things like what are your values? What heats you up? And by that, what I mean by that is like what topics get you excited? What things do you love to lean into and talk about? Also, what makes you unique as a writer? And oftentimes, this is tough for writers to put a pin on because they'll just think my writing's good, but I don't know quite what makes me stand out. And oftentimes, that's some kind of swirl between what your professional skills or background is and what your passions are. And that can also encompass some of your mood as well. So I'll give a quick example. I have a client who writes, I guess she calls it young adult tragedy. So it's like tragic novels with really meaningful messages. But when you meet her in real life, she is so bubbly and just sweet. And like you would never think that she wrote about those really deep, traumatic topics. So the way that she brands herself is I'll make you cry your eyes out, but then I'll buy you ice cream after, right? So the idea is that it's like when you meet her, personality is going to be a bit different than what's on the page. And that also makes her stand out as a writer.
Yeah, interesting. And so what are mistakes that people should avoid when building their personal brand?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think when you're building your personal brand, you want to be careful that you're not getting accidentally too inspired by other folks, whether that's entrepreneurs, writers, depending on who you are and what you're into. What tends to happen, and frankly, it's not even people's fault because it ends up being a question they're often asked if you're hiring somebody to do a website for you, for example. Oftentimes people will say, what inspires you? Or give me examples of what you like. And then what ends up happening is you become like this carbon copy or an amalgamation of three different people. And then you're not really encapsulating what makes you unique. I would say my number one tip around a mistake that people make is keep your eyes on your own paper as much as you possibly can. That doesn't mean completely shielding yourself from everything and everyone that's out there, but just really focusing in on you and creating more than consuming so that you can really dive into what makes you stand out and you unique rather than taking too much inspiration from what's outside. And I'll give one other tip around that. Whenever you are creating, so an example would be like if you are somebody who writes books about finance, let's say, I would highly recommend when you're in that creation stage that you're not taking in any other finance books or finance writing. Instead, take something in from another genre, right? So watch fiction or read a thriller book or something, right? So you can take creative inspiration from things that are outside of your genre, and that will help avoid that accidental inspiration that I mentioned.
Hmm. Interesting. Now we'll get into the kind of, because you've worked with major companies like Microsoft and Sony, Hallmark, and what can small business owners, entrepreneurs learn from big brands when it comes to storytelling and PR?
Yeah. It is interesting because there's not that much difference between whether you are one of the largest companies in the world, which I just came off contract with Microsoft, so that's very fresh for me, and whether you are a small business or a solopreneur. So much of it is very similar in how we tell stories and how we put things out there in the world. I would say the difference, frankly, is that when you're a larger corporation, to invest in those things, where oftentimes when we are small businesses, we think about creating, but we don't put that much energy into the promotion and visibility piece. And I
Mm.
was just having a conversation about this like an hour ago with someone where we pour so much of ourselves into that. And oftentimes that's because of resources too, right? We have the resources to create, but we don't always have the resources for all the other bits and bobs that are needed within our own enterprise or our own company, whereas corporations have loads of resources. So it's very difficult sometimes to compete at that level. But it is good to take a cue from them for thinking about your work as a business, particularly if you identify as a creative, because it's very easy to just think of yourself as I'm a writer or I'm a screenwriter or I'm a filmmaker or I'm an artist versus no, I'm actually a business owner and then this is my product, right? This is what I put out. So I would say it's really good to take some of that cue from a company as to how they are structuring things, how they're really prioritizing marketing, visibility, publicity, and operations alongside their product, which oftentimes gets left out when we are a small business owner or solopreneur.
Yeah. And I believe I believe you're right. Tony Robbins, he put out a great, one of his programs. He was talking about, are you the artist, are you the entrepreneur, are you the business owner, or are you the investor? And I love this saying how you believe creatives need to treat their work like a business. Their creativity and their work of art, that's the art, but they have to invest in the systems of processes, outsourcing, artificial intelligence to actually make it viable. The I think the best example of that is like Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, that type of partnership. The other question is, what's interesting is because you've worked with Netflix, and Netflix is the not the, I would say the number one at creating binge-worthy content. And so what is the key to making content binge-worthy and people making people obsessed, and just the secret to creating that kind of pool?
Yeah, there are a couple things that go into that, but you want to take some cues to like how, if we're looking at Netflix, for example, we can take some cues and how they do things. So, one thing is the majority of things that are very popular on Netflix are series, right? Not movies. Movies do well, but it's really the series that are keeping people coming back and hungry for more. And as business owners, that's us, right? We're not a one and done closed loop. We're not putting a movie out in the world and then shutting the door. We're keeping going. We need like seasons. We need our series to never end. So if we're thinking of a Netflix model, we have to think about when we create content, what does that look like? So oftentimes as business owners, we think about things in a silo. So it's what am I going to write about this week? Or what am I going to put out there? And there's not a lot of intention to like hook things together, create cliffhangers, serialize them, right? So there's like a thematic arc that goes over all of your content. And then really bringing that down or distilling that down into every 6 months or every quarter, what that might look like. So what I'll do with my clients is we'll think about it from the really high level. Like, this is your show. right? So tell me what your show is about. And then think of a really sexy hook or log. We call it a log line in the industry. What's a one sentence descriptor of what people can expect from your content? And then from there, we start to distill it down what that would look like. And I usually do it by quarter so that you're not working too far in advance and like feeling like you're falling out of trend, right? So if you think about each quarter, it's okay, what is like the thematic arc of this quarter? What message do you want to drive? It's the same thing as a season of television on Netflix. They always have a theme for that season. What story are we telling this season? You go to any show, they all have the same thing. So you want to think about that for yourself. This quarter, what message do I want to drive? And how does that hook into the bigger thematic arc of the show? Then from there, you can start to think about cliffhangers, right? So when is it appropriate at the end of your content to tease up your next piece of content? Think about any show you watch. You're only watching the next episode because there's like a good cliffhanger, right? That's why you keep going. So we can do that same exact thing with our content as long as you have that serialized element to it. So this is particularly important if you're creating launch content. So anyone who is putting out content that with an intent of selling something, so you're like hyping one thing over a condensed period of time, maybe a course or a workshop or something like that, or a book. Let's say there are 12 pieces of content, like 12 emails you're sending out to promote this one course. We'll hook them all together and put cliffhangers at the end of them so that people keep reading and keep going and getting excited. And one other quick tip I'll give in this is a really great thing to do, which people love, is to give people your origin story. So that's a very common storytelling component, right? Of pretty much like most movies or television shows that exist out there. Everybody wants to know like the character's origin story. Your business origin story is really interesting. Instead of just trying to tell that in a single blog post or newsletter, which would probably be quite heavy and difficult to do, or waiting to tell it in a memoir kind of thing, which you can do someday, but probably aren't going to do tomorrow, you can think about maybe releasing like a 7-part series where you tell your origin story, not every beat. Don't make it like Game of Thrones, where there's just swords that expansive, right? Just think about over 7 episodes, we'll put that in quotes, episodes, right? What would that look like? Like what big moments or themes do you want to draw out that would be like those 7 beats that really were impactful in the story of you and your business?
Mm. Yeah, I really love that. It's almost like a mini course in crafting a story that grabs attention and making it binge worthy. When it comes to a lot of authors and entrepreneurs struggle with publicity, and what's the biggest mistake they make when trying to get attention for their work?
They just talk about their work.
Mhm.
They think about what's in it for me, which
Mhm.
is I want publicity, versus what's in it for them, meaning what's in it for the media. So in that case, that could be you, right? Like you are the media, you're the podcast host. So if I just came to you and said, I have a book, you really should read it. There's really nothing in it for you. Why would you have me on your show? What value is that to your audience, which is what who you have to serve, right? You have to serve your audience. So just me coming and saying, I wrote a book that's a paranormal romance, you should read it. You're going to just go shrug, pass on me, and not want to have me on the show. But if I come to you and I say, hey, I'd love to be on your show, I noticed that you talk about these topics. Here's a topic that I haven't seen you cover, but I do talk about, and why I think your audience would be interested in it. And now I'm coming at it with a lens of why this would be interesting for you versus what this can do for me. So it's just that little shift in thinking.
Yeah. And it goes along the same lines as how you're crafting a story, like you're talking about launch and like the overall big picture, and how do you create hooks and cliffhangers and just make it more what you're referring to as relatable. We're coming closer to the end of the conversation, and Hollywood is the example to learn about storytelling techniques, and what techniques can non-writers use to make their brand, social media, and public speaking more engaging.
Yeah, so this is going to be a really simple one, but it's one that's often missed is all of your content, and I don't care if that's a caption on Instagram, so that could be that short, needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. So in film, we call it act 1, act 2, act 3, right? So it's like act 1 is the setup of your story or whatever you're trying to say. Act 2 is the meat of it. And then act 3 has to have closure or cliffhanger. Cliffhangers are okay too, as I said earlier. But really thinking through that, those three beats, act 1, act 2, act 3, or just beginning, middle, and end makes a big difference. And just checking yourself every time you create that content and saying, you can even write it on a piece of paper or however, you all as the audience likes to create content. That can be step one, is just say beginning, middle, end, and fill in some notes as to what you'd want each of those sections to be.
Wow.
Otherwise, it often will fall flat because it will feel like it's missing a piece. Usually it's missing a good ending. So if you arc it out that way, that becomes a lot easier. And then another thing I will say is a good tip from screenwriting in particular, because screenwriting is really about pruning. So we're constantly like, you think about if that word is on the page in the script, it better belong there. Otherwise, you prune it out. Whereas in books, I feel like it's a little bit different. You could be a bit more flowery. There's some words that can go there that in a script would just get chopped. I like to think about script writing when it comes to content writing, because when we are writing content for our businesses, we're dealing with like very small attention spans. So we want to make sure that we get to the point as quickly as possible. One thing is whenever you rough draft a piece of content, let's say it's a newsletter that you're sending out, always go back and see if there's some piece of that you can cut. Oftentimes it's the beginning. It's the beginning that can be chopped. It's the equivalent of if somebody's telling you a story and they say, "Oh, you'll never believe what happened to me yesterday. I pulled up at Target, I got a cart, I went to the door, I walked in," and they tell you all these details. And then the thing that happened is like 15 minutes into the story, and they could have left out all the Target parking lot part. So that is an example of what often happens with our content as business owners. So it's a great thing to just go back and say, is there something I can prune from this? Any part of this I can prune to make this easier and more digestible for people.
Yeah. Excellent. How can people find you and follow you and learn more from you and connect with you?
Yeah. My website is the best place to go. It's just my name, melissacassera.com. And then on there, you'll see a link to my newsletter with right week, another great to keep in touch with me. And also, I'm on LinkedIn if you use LinkedIn. And then I also am on Instagram. However, I usually just write about my books there. So if you're not interested in the book content, I'd say that's not the place to go. But all my name is the way to find me on all of those platforms.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks so much for a great masterclass on PR marketing and keep up the great work. And I think the audience really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was so great.